The Studebaker Poem. If you try to stop it long enough to say anything about it, then okay, that's one thing you can do, like it was orange, say, or green, which is how it seemed just then as it whooshed by. Maybe lumpy, slightly oblong, but who's to say it was gone that quick? And I think what that tells us is that stopping is problematic at best, because pretty soon you're going to have a taxonomy of things that might not exist, or their existence is pretty dependent on the stopping and who did it. That would be you in this case. And even worse is what happens to space and time under conditions of stoppage. Oh God, this is so great and beautiful. I never get this excited about prose, and I hope you will too, because we're launched now. I mean, my whole chest opens up and I can finally breathe. Zang! Oh my. Oh my, I have to stop and take a break. It's too much. Well, and then much time passes. Slow time. Days, a week. Well, that turned out not to be so sustainable, since it was really, wow, a flash in the pan, as my mother used to say, at least in so-called real time, by which I mean by the clock time. And I fell down off that pinnacle pretty quick, or maybe I didn't so much fall as get blown off by that wind I was breathing. And it wasn't even so much wind as water, since I am simultaneously on some peak and deep, deep undersea, which is without any doubt whatsoever exactly where I want to be. And also to take you there and, whoa, here we go again. It's dropping down or flooding up into real time, just as all the worlds kiss at this singularity which lasts, not at all long, which I suppose allows you to take a break, or maybe is protective and lets a normal person live like other normal people, not flashed up into whammy spaces, flash, 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 and we only are here, or seem to be, like the frames in a reel of film. And how passé is that? It's really having a tiger by the tail, let me tell you, and I need to step away from this a bit. Excuse me while I kiss the sky. I'll be right back. But with time being so flexible, it's hard to say how long anything is. Or it's like sticking your head up into a fierce storm with terrific howling winds threatening to blow you off to Oz, or worse and better, with white paint streaked with golden reds and violent greens and final oranges, all whipped to a frenzy, making me think of Cy Twombly sometimes dripping and whirling magnificent colors. Wind, wind, wind howls. The sounds are colors. I see and hear them rush and spiral. Quick, quick, pull back into still and the silence below, where time is not so fierce and fast, more molasses-like, and things take shape more fully. Still life, colors on a table, in the swelling sun, a knife, an apple, a bottle of Bordeaux, and so on. Shapes shift and fall apart. Hang on to that orange, but we live here mostly nonetheless, until I begin to feel my feet begin to sink, as if standing on fishes, and real time ceases to matter again. I breathe with my feet and all my skin. The atmosphere is viscous and eddies slowly between my toes and fingers, and your hair swims out from your head as if you were the Sargasso Sea itself. It's not that things are slower now, though that could certainly be. But everything is in everything else like water and water, and everything seems to matter more. And I am somewhat less frantic, though that's not very important really. It's just how I feel about it. All the colors are all more continuous. You could actually have rainbows here because it is slow enough. And I realize that colors have velocities and not only sounds. And now the world starts to tie itself together and synesthesia becomes inevitable, not bizarre. And oh dear, paintings are more real than the things themselves, and abstract paintings I suddenly see are the most real of all because they show the colors and the sounds and the velocities and their vectors simultaneously, or as close as anyone can come. And this apple here, this bunch of grapes, this pineapple are all too complicated to ever be at all. We have to stop them in one time, in one space. Snap, shot, fixed, stopped. Meanwhile, in another universe, this apple is zipping, flying, roaring in that fierce wind which it is, and screaming shades of red, making symphonies of colors choreographed at 1,000 speeds, the vectors shooting off everywhere. Not one thing, but 1,000 dancing images reflected of its selves, each breathing the heavy, viscous fluid, making everything one, making all things breathe and drink the same intoxicating, mystical food, eating and drinking and swimming in the liquid air and dark, shining, glowing, beating, curling body of the world. And vivace, whack, 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 yellow! Suddenly, and for no reason at all, it grinds to a halt. Chromatic black. And we do too. Time returns, flows in clock time, public time. It's sad, but calm, liquid. The words work quietly again. The heart slows to bump a thump. We inhale deeply, breathe out very slowly. Red is red again. Sea is sea. The battered old Studebaker cruises the Arizona highway like they all used to do back in the day, the tires humming on the hot, hot pavement, the hypnotic lines flashing silent underneath, and the dry air chaps your cracked lips bad, and they bleed, but just a little bit. Authors. In the beginning was the Word. This makes some people feel much better. Our Father who art, etc., can keep one from despair. And then we have Die Fröhliche Wissenschaft. He sort of has the right idea, but he's so Teutonic about it, so very serious, in spite of the gay business. But you can read everything profitably if you're a writer and working on your own book. It's a question of authority. I'm a pragmatist. I'm okay with God as an idea, but we don't ever get very close, and we only ever see indirectly what she intends. We can't be sure what she wrote, except I think that pretty much anything that happens to me comes from somewhere outside me, since when I look in here, I don't actually find too much that seems to be me. I'm not really very much here at all. I take all of it as coming from elsewhere, and I'm happy to just kind of at least begin to notice things, which I think is awfully hard and takes up most of my time these days. I think maybe that's about all I'm up for today, anyway. which seems to me justifiable, because if you can manage it, then it's probably, I think, best to figure out where you are before you blame it all on God or start screwing around trying to change things, though I do understand that can be problematic politically with all the suffering in the world. But you know what happens when people mess around with stuff they don't understand, which is pretty much everything, or so it seems to me. So let's at least see if we can figure out where we are first. Okay? Like, for instance, right now, the inside of my head is expanding quite rapidly. I see constellations of stars arranged along the suture lines and where my ears were. My pineal gland has become a sun, a luminous blue giant, whereas my limbic system is an incredibly beautiful and multicolored nebula like the crab maybe, or the horseshoe. There is an intense cluster of white dwarves dancing and hopping around down below where my pawns used to be. Oh, wow. Oh, wow. And Jesus H. Christ, how can anybody ever think of being a terrorist when all this shit is going on? I ask you, what are people thinking? Oh, damn it all to hell. They're all of them completely crazy in my book. The Language of Angels. I wonder how exhausted you can be and still write a poem. It's not automatic writing. That would be gibberish. But I have control at some level. Wow, how many levels of control are there? I think there must be an awful lot. Like, I'm correcting my spelling as I go along here, and not just typing anything. I'm a terrible typist, even though my mother hired a high school girl to teach me to type when I was in grade school. That sure was boring beyond belief, QWERTY, and whatnot. I hated it and never learned anything. It's just like me to be that way, and now, of course, I regret it, like I regret not. Oh, hell, I'm going to bed. But now I can't sleep thinking about all those levels of control and all the levels of editors that brings to mind, or being, or existence, or something, I guess. It's like the ranks and ranks of angels and the scribes who write and the guardians who order. And are there angels for typing mistakes? Maybe that girl, I forget her name, but she had dark hair. Margie, actually, I think, which is not a good name for an angel, but who knows? And maybe the bottommost rank would be for gibberish typing, and there is a mess of really fallen angels who hang out in the basement, smoking and drinking and playing cards when they're supposed to be ordering the gibberish, so at least it stays in being and doesn't vanish into nothingness. But seriously, I think there must be more levels of ordering than we know, from that gibberish to getting words right. And even each word is a world unto itself with etymology and sound. Oh, wow, I forgot to start with letters. Each letter has to have an angel. The scholars of the Torah know that for sure, and the Quran. And I don't think that Christians have that because they don't really have a sacred language. So that explains the different celestial hierarchies of angels. It's all because of language. Oh God, this is really exciting. I cannot even begin to imagine what magnificent diagramming sentences must depend on. But we did it in 8th grade, and I got an F, because I couldn't think of anything more stupid. But now I find that even I put the cat in the blue box requires incalculable angels, archangels, principalities, and probably all the way up to cherubim and seraphim, all arrayed in geometrically sublime and moving ranks like splendid marching bands on a football field, only n-dimensional, and marching in historical circles and loops and crossings and hyperspaces in and out of time, and it only gets more so when we ponder Dante or Hamlet, or even just two people talking about breakfast, especially if they love each other, or really if they have any serious relationship at all, because then the stuff that's getting flung around with all those letters and words and even spaces between words and letters is really pretty meaty, all of which reminds me, here comes the sun, and now I need some oatmeal. Eat. I need to get a running start when I do this. Or no, actually, I need to drop down into what's actually happening. But then drop down isn't quite right either. So maybe rise up, but that's much worse. So maybe shifting sideways is better, or some kind of opening happens. But maybe it's best not to think about it at all, except that I want to get at whatever it is, since I think doing it is really so easy and so terribly hard. It's a segue, not a break. I mean, you can break, but then it seems so serious and poetical, and that bothers me a lot these days. I mean, who am I to pontificate, though actually that's a really good word, pontificate, since it comes from pont, or pons, meaning bridge, and that's pretty much right. You need to cross a bridge while being in exactly the same place. Don't you move a goddamned inch, but suddenly you're plugged into all this stuff going on in the same place at the same time. It's like parallel universes. I really do imagine that to be the best way to manage it, as it's like this immense river with a zillion currents all running alongside, and you can move from one to another by shifting. But no, I think now that it is most like dropping down. We live in a foam most of the time. The confused surface little bubble islands swell and breaking, and new ones popping up all the time, clusters of them stuck together. And it seems like stability when they spin, eddy away, and disappear. But underneath is the current where the real energy is, and all the life. And you can imagine that the events and the things there are all the same. The fluid is them. It is both event and the thing the event is. And the connections between things, events, is the fluid itself. But no, this won't do either. There's no end to this. We drop down in from here from the river itself, which is now too thing-like, too literal, too much a river. Drop down, shift over, black space, spaghetti-like diagrams, bleak feelings overwhelm us. Here, gray-brown, smudged colors seep into the mind, the limbic system, particularly the dentate gyrus that regulates happiness. Oh, no, we're flooded with remorse and black moodiness. Drop down, shift. The raft collides with the boulder, and we nearly capsize in the rapids, can barely breathe in the spray-soaked air, arms whirling the paddles over everyone's heads. Too fast, be careful. Yellow streaks of blades in air, arcing like electricity between sky and earth. Flash, flash, zap, and the lines go dead. We hear nothing now but the breathing of the stars coming over the suddenly silent telephone lines. We hit the button on the ancient rotary dial phone. Hello, is anyone there? Nothing. And then the dial tone returns, a featureless, soft, but horrible monotone signifying nothing. And we drop shift again to find that we are on the ancient earth, or a planet indistinguishable from it. Long before the Ediacaran age, it is hot and wet and dim. The only life, the matted blue-green algae, the foaming breakers crash. Shift! My head hurts from too much whiskey, and I have lost all control. I can barely see the streetlights in the rain, the red neon signs flashing. Eat! A Little Loopy. Imagine that everything has feet that you can't see, and that everything is running all the time, like the Red Queen said, and you have to move pretty quick just to stay in one place. What's up, you ask? It's hard to tell. But there's a little man inside my skull, which is very empty, and he's been cleaning it with brushes and such. Now he's finishing up by licking out the crevices with his serpentine, pathologically corrugated tongue. I wonder how long these things have been going on. Several pudgy, grayish-pink custodians live inside my gut. Oh, wow. What is happening here? Is this surrealism or what? But actually, it's true that I do have some novel probiotics living in there. Only by getting them out here can they do their real work, which is, however, unclear. Is this investigative journalism or experimental biology? It isn't theoretical anything, of that much I'm sure, and that's a blessing, thank God, after all those years. But these little persons are probably what I was most afraid of anyway. And there are chain gangs of tiny, gnome-like, well-muscled, pin-headed goons bound together in long columns, who pretty much run my so-called voluntary muscles, while I glide along the floor on thousands, nay, millions of extremely tiny legs, relatives of the millipedes that populate damp basements everywhere. They're so cosmopolitan, and here, quite useful, as it saves energy, better utilized in photographing the off-white billows of fluff that emerge from the head. And what justifies any of this? Anyway, perhaps it is just the fact that right now I cannot get out of the chair because of the sticky secretions emitted by the minute crustacea lining my legs. And so we see that in the end, descriptive natural history is perhaps the easiest of all the sciences, and the hardest part is the interpretive apparatus that must be appended as a gloss for the interested reader. And yet again, the question of editorial intention arises, and one wonders, doesn't one, what the purpose of the author may have been, and whether the editor has the right, or even the duty, to expunge, or at least correct the excesses and infractions of sense and or good taste of the originator. And one feels, I think, the simultaneous presence of many such editors, wearing a variety of hats, Elizabethan, cowboy, backwards baseball, fur felt fedora, and the like, mostly men, in a poor attempt to cross-dress the grandeur and silliness of race day at Churchill Downs, and raising again the questions of style versus substance, and the bases for discrimination, and the uses of language in any of its forms. Ba 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 bang. What the hell is going on here anyway? But Jesus Christ, I've got to say in all honesty that all of this at least is actual. It is an activity, a real full-blooded activity of imagination, and as such is primary. Really? Primary in what sense? As opposed to editorial comments upon said actual activity? Or is there no difference? One is constrained in ways the other is not? Is that it? One is about the other, and so here, Ouroboros, feeding off one's own tail? Well, if that's the case, then there are little round, self-devouring worms everywhere, as all acts of language, wham, there was another, and another, are commentaries on other acts of language? No, they are not, damn it, he said, speaking from the podium the little men have set up inside his head, which we see from the bleachers on stage where the chorus will stand overlooking the public dissection of the author's head, during which the top of his skull has been removed, and we see those little men with their many, many and highly colorful hats, and all of this is televised and saved on TiVo and will be available on YouTube presently, to be looped and sampled erratically on video displays in many of the major contemporary art museums of the world, where we find that something seemingly meaningless and wholly isolated in its idiosyncrasy has morphed into celebrity and is, one may hope, valuable simply by being properly contextualized and repeated endlessly for a discerning public. Fiat lux. Appendix. The worms themselves are happiest about all of this, as they are now undulating in their accustomed, timeless manner in an elaborate meshwork of interconnecting loops and swirls within the recesses of the fertile earth. Their tender cephalic tips probe with sensitivity in the darkness for barely detectable chemical signals of divine guidance. Editor's note: we were unable to come to consensus on either the dating or the significance of this very early work. It has been retained in spite of some strong objections. One feels here, at times, a certain childlike repulsion, as when they become distraught and agitated if one makes the horrible faux pas of allowing two separate foods to touch each other on their tiny, carefully arranged dinner plates. Doesn't one? Loop. May 8th, 2014, 12:05 p.m., 44.65 north, 69.03 west. Plastics. Styrofoam? Oh, God. Do I have to think about that? Please. I can never get coffee at Dunkin' Donuts because of those horrible cups. How do people drink out of them? They squeak like fingernails on a chalkboard, if anybody remembers chalkboards. And the smell, they make the coffee smell like shreds of PVC pipe or like those awful toxic markers they use now instead of chalk. So you have the worst of both worlds in one cup of horrible coffee, and it breaks up into little hummocky pieces that smell and squeal and float on water, so the whole world is covered in it. The clueless fish, the dismal whales, the pieces of plastic jetty and trap markers floating high, bouncing happily oblivious to the waves and the weather. They are impervious to it all, like Leibniz's windowless monads, those gazillion weightless, silent pieces. So sad it is to know they are everywhere and never ever going away, except in the final cataclysm, which will suck everything back to the original state of great potential being. You think probably God was pretty hopeful, you know. Hey, watch this, he said. And 15 billion years later, it's pretty much mostly entropy with pieces of styrofoam floating among the bubbles and other colorful, happy plastic trash. Our version of eternity, I guess. Some random worries. I don't use paper clips much anymore. We're pretty much paperless now, except for books and Post-its, which are an alternative form of memory for when it fades. I miss the games you can play with them, hooking them together and twisting them into shapes. But oh dear, there's this awful guy inside my head who reminds me a lot of Dwight Pink, who terrified us all in grade school and grew up bad and died in a shootout on the highway many years later, which is a true story. And he wants me to make a pokey thing out of this paperclip and gouge out somebody's eyes just because I can, and the thought makes me squirm and wince, so I'm glad that we're paperless now. Oh crap. It's 5 a.m. and there's a pimple on my nose. Not much to be done about it. Hot water and soap is about all, and don't rub too hard. I'm used to this. And it isn't at all bad now, but my aged face is an archaic wreckage of ancient histories, the particulars of some of which I remember with considerable clarity and dismay, since long ago it was a very public, private misery, and eventually a doctor friend of the family couldn't take it anymore and told my parents they ought to take me to a specialist, which they did, and drove me all the way to New Haven for it, which seemed then a very long ride, which it is really not at all, so he could regularly stick needles in me and give me pills and goop and charge money, which helped some. But I think they're better at it now. I hope so, in case you know someone who is in pain with every smile and dripping pus and blood in public, so they have to carry a handkerchief to wipe it off. It's pretty gross. Maybe I shouldn't have said any of this, but I grew up okay, really, and only scarred in the flesh by it. But I thought you ought to know about it, just in case. I used to use the little tab on the zipper of my pants to peel off the ends of my fingernails. I never bit or chewed them, as that is really rude. I remember one kid in a physics class who sat in front of me with his hand in his mouth and snorted and puffed so you could hear him 2 rows away as he chomped and chewed and worked his fingers around in his mouth at really awkward angles for the whole period. And he did this every class. He must not have had any fingernails left at all. He drove me completely insane with annoyance, but this is not about him, but about the little clippers that I use now that I am mature and a little less neurotic. And I really enjoy using them, except for the one pair in the vanity that I always grab by mistake and that are not sharp enough, and I can't cut my nails with them, and then I have to get the other ones, which are always for some reason in the back, and I find that annoying at 5 a.m., and then what are you supposed to do with little pieces of fingernail that fly off in random arcs with a tiny snap and land in the sink or the toilet or on the floor and are really sharp if you get one stuck in your finger by mistake when you try to pick them up. And I know I should do this outside, but it's hard in the winter and my wife gets mad at having to clean them up, though I do try most of the time. Nobody ever taught me how to do any of this or to floss properly for that matter either. Life is so hard. There are some things that are really interesting and useful to know, but you can't talk about them to other people, which is too bad in a way, because I would like to talk about them to somebody, since it's no good going over and over them in your mind by yourself for days afterwards, which is not at all the same thing. Like there's this one thing that I read about how to do long ago in the Whole Earth catalog it was, in case you were ever in the woods alone, far from civilization, and this one bad and awkward thing were to happen to you and how you would fix it yourself. I suspect it was from an Army field manual, now that I think of it, and I was so impressed by reading about it that I never forgot it for like 50 years. And then recently, I was on a trip, and lo and behold, this thing happened to me, and I had to fix it myself in the men's room at JFK, which is very far from civilization, I think. And boy, am I ever glad I read that Whole Earth catalog. And I would like to tell you about it, but I can't, which I feel guilty about, because sometime you might really, really need to know, so you should probably get your own manual. Sorry. The 8-penny nail is one of the great inventions, as are all nails, of course, and there are a lot of them, which you will know if you are a carpenter, and should know anyway, even if you're not, because they are so useful, and they have a long and complex history, and how they are measured in pennyweight is interesting too, but not the point here, where my father wants to be, because he never went anywhere without a hammer handy nearby. Not that he was always hitting nails, but he was that kind of guy, and sort of a bulldozer personally, though he meant well. And one day, when he was out building our house and nailing in some cross-bridging between the joists, he got his little finger down in the angle between the cross piece and the joist, and wham, he nailed himself to the joist with, you guessed it, an 8-penny nail, which was memorable for all of us, but for him particularly, as he had to pry himself free by pulling the claw of his hammer against his finger and yanking. Boy, I bet that hurt. And he sat at the table with his finger in the bloody ice water for a really long time. Ice water always helps if you smash your finger with a hammer or if you nail yourself to the house. Remember that.